Thank you, Carl, for your greetings. We continue today in this season of Pentecost with the reading of Matthew's Gospel. And today, the 14th chapter of Matthew, this familiar story of Jesus' care for his disciples, beginning with verse 22. So immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. By this time, the winds had come up and the boat was battered by the waves. It was so far from the land, and the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Card games. Card games. It's one of those short stories that has stuck in my mind over the years. It was written by an Episcopalian priest and writer and composer named Martin Bell. Card games. In the story, Bell describes in rather simple fashion what might be called two ways of looking at life. In the first way, he says that life might be compared to a giant picture puzzle. Picture puzzles are made up of lots of pieces, and they ultimately have to go together. In order to put the puzzle together, one has to have a lot of energy and persistence, and if you're like me, the picture on the front of the box that shows what it's supposed to look like. But most of all, we have to have the belief that things will always fit, at least eventually. In fact, the pieces were pre-designed to fit. So getting just the right piece in just the right place is the key to success. In short, it has to go together. On the other hand, says Bell, there are card games. And card games are quite different, especially gin rummy, which is Martin Bell's favorite card game. There's timing when you play cards, and there's risk when you play cards, as well as all the constant decisions that you have to make about the value of each card to the outcome of the total game. You have to play what's in your hand. There are also other players in the game. And those players besides you have an interest and need in what's going on, and they may affect you directly. And of course, there's always the kitty, that stack of unplayed, unknown cards in the middle of the table. The kitty then always brings into the game the quality of the lack of predictability as to the outcome of the game. In the end of his story, Bell confesses that he finds the card game analogy to be more expressive of how he experiences his life. No matter how much at times he would like for all things in life to fit together like a puzzle, where they fit just right and they were designed to be that way, he says life is much more like playing what's in your hand at a particular point in time. The unknowns of the kitty are always before us in the game. And regardless of who we are not playing at life alone. At the end of his story, Bill says, "Oh, by the way, it's your play." Just spending time again this week with Matthew's story of Jesus coming to the disciples on the lake during an early morning storm left me thinking of the card game analogy of life and faith. And to be honest, so did listening to all the news of the week in places like the Middle East or Afghanistan or Ukraine or some shooting range with a 9-year-old. There's this deployment of the use of all kinds of military forces and equipment and technology and gadgets out there around the world. There are bluffs that are made. There are strong suits paraded out by various people and groups. There are discussions and debates held by various parties on the rules of the game. There are differences over what is acceptable behavior between contending players. And the stakes of the game are high. All the players are aware of the anxiety and the fear created by the game, as well as the gravity of the unknown possibilities in the kitty, if you will. It would be better, of course, if international relations were like a picture puzzle where all the pieces fit so neatly together. But they aren't. So we must go on with the game, even if at times we would like to think that we could just choose not to play. Interestingly enough, in Matthew's story here, it's Jesus who makes the first move. And then he invites Peter and all the rest of humankind to do the same. In the verses just prior to this passage, Jesus has heard of the death of John the Baptist at the hands of King Herod. He knows the danger he's in as he continues his preaching and his teaching and his healing. He goes off to ponder his situation alone, to think and to pray, says Matthew. And the crowds won't let him alone. He is followed by them. And so he has compassion on their needs and he responds. He even feeds them. Some 5,000 people to be exact. And following the meal, there are even some who want to make him king. So Jesus decides he's going to move on. And he sends the disciples on across the lake in a boat. If you read it carefully, Matthew says he made them go. And then he goes up into the hills beside the lake to be alone and to pray. Now, I think it's easy for us to lose sight of how much fear Jesus must have faced here. He realized the personal and political danger he was in. And personally, I think he sent his disciples on in front of him in order to protect them from unnecessary danger and suspicion. But he also chose to take his own fears to God. He didn't run from being alone with his fears like we often do. He deliberately chose solitude as an environment in which to face fear. And he seemed to know that even in his fear, he was never alone. In the early morning, the disciples are still out on the water in the boat, and the winds begin to blow very heavily against that boat. Jesus evidently sees the boat being tossed about, with the disciples evidently threatened, and he chooses to go to them. Now, although there is some disagreement among biblical scholars as to how best to translate the phrase walking on the sea in verses 25 and 26, it is obvious that Jesus chooses to come to the disciples in the midst of a precarious situation. And when they see him, they don't recognize him, and they're very afraid. So he says, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." Now, it would be significant enough, I think, to stop this story right here. For Jesus demonstrates so clearly the truth about God that when the winds are contrary and we are in danger of being overcome by the storms of life, God comes to us. God makes the effort to communicate with us the nature of that presence. And God's wish for us is to take heart and not be afraid. Most of us, facing difficult times, would do well to claim that proclamation as a reality. And I think many times we really try to. But then, besides saying, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid," Jesus says something else, something very, very important. Peter asks, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." If it is you. If. I remember Fred Craddock's image of the word "if." Two trapeze artists are 40 feet above the circus floor on different platforms, no safety net. The one over here begins swinging toward the other, upside down, on the trapeze bar hanging by his knees, back and forth. And then in a few minutes, the one over here leaves the platform hanging by hands on the bar and swings toward the other, back and forth, back and forth. And then the one swinging by his hands lets go. And the distance between the hands of the man hanging by his knees and the hands of the one who has just let go is if. Lord, if it is you, bid me come to you on the water. Lord, if it is you, when the winds are contrary, besides "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid," what else is there? And the answer we hear is come. Come. It's your move. It's your play. You can't walk on the water of life when you're cowering in the boat, Jesus implies. I won't dictate your response. You have a will of your own. But I bid you come. You see, even when the winds are contrary, when the storms most threaten our lives, our futures, our safety, our worth, our choices, our self-esteem, our faith, God is there not only to say, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." God is there to say, "Come to me. Let's move on from here together. I am sufficient for your life. And in Christ I have redeemed all of life, including yours. And I have declared that it is good. Come." My friends, this is a marvelous revelation of God that Jesus gives to us. A God whose salvation is realized particularly in the difficult times of life. A God whose presence and reassurance are always empowering and strengthening us in our discipleship. A God whose invitation to relationship is always calling us to move on in trust and in love. I know of a woman named Eleanor. She's in her late 80s. She's outlived her 2 children and her husband. And some months ago, she found out that she has incurable cancer. Some days, she needs to stay in bed most of the days. Other times, she feels pretty good. And Eleanor said she doesn't know how much longer she has to live, but she knows it's not too long. She lives in a nursing home and wishes she didn't have to, but she really doesn't complain all that much. And when you go to visit Eleanor, some days she's not in her room. And that means that it's one of her good days, and she's down the hall somewhere visiting others and trying, as she says, to cheer them up a little bit today. If she is in her room and you visit her, she always wants to hold hands and to pray. And after you pray, she prays a long time. And there's not 1 ounce of self-pity or concern for herself in her prayers. She always thanks God for sending you there. She prays for your strength. She asks God to meet your needs. And she wants God to fill your heart with His love. When you leave Eleanor's room, you know you might not see her alive again. You smile and you shake hands and you shake your head as well in wonder. A dying woman, a person who's been dealt some pretty tough cards in the game of life, a person whose personal storms leaves her every reason to be absorbed in her own suffering, yet a person who somehow rises above her own pain long enough to cheer someone up or lift up the needs of a minister who's in need of God's care. So I ask you, is Eleanor a card player? Yeah, I think she is. And I think she's a pretty good one. You see, she's learned a lot from playing with the Galilean guy, the one who knows what it's like to be afraid in the boat of life when the winds are contrary. He told her, "Take heart, have no fear, and no matter what happens, I am with you." And she believed him. They spend a lot of time together. And if you ask the people around the nursing home, they'll tell you she can walk on water. Amen.